I'm delighted to welcome our speaker, Chet Van Duzer. And Chet is a board member of the Lazarus Project at the University of Rochester, which brings multispectral imaging, a technology that allows the recovery of text and illustrations from damaged manuscripts, to cultural institutions around the world. And I'm told by Chet and Nick that he and his institute work miracles with manuscripts which look completely illegible and are brought to life technologically. So that's a very encouraging development. Chet has published extensively on medieval and Renaissance maps, and with books including Henricus Martellus's World Map at Yale, Multispectral Imaging, and Martin Waldseemüller's Carta Marina of 1516. So a whole variety of books about maps themselves and about techniques to be used on them. His current book project is on cartographic cartouches. So it's a real pleasure to be able to pass over to Chet for this evening's talk. Now, one of the members of staff in the Bodleian Map Room, Debbie Hall, whom some of you may have seen during the Women and Maps correspondence, has told us that we have mistimed this lecture because it should be on World Pirate Day, which is apparently on the 15th of September each year, a fact which I hadn't been aware of up to now. So apologies for having done that, but I'm sure we'll all manage to celebrate Pirate Day in any case, and I'm particularly confident that we'll enjoy this evening's talk on shipwrecks and treasure in the manuscript maps of William Hack. Thanks very much, Chet.
Well, thank you very much, Liz, for that very generous introduction. Well, let's go ahead and get started. I'll share my screen here. Okay, very good. So we'll jump right in. So I'll be talking today about the manuscript maps of William Hack and their indications of shipwrecks and the treasure on those shipwrecks. And I'll start out just by showing one of the maps in one of Hack's atlases, which we see here. This is the opening from the 1685 atlas in Greenwich. And Hack's atlases offer a very detailed depiction of the western coast of the Americas, from Mexico's south to the southern tip of South America. And they're very detailed, not only visually, but textually. They offer, as we'll see, detailed instructions about how to manage in a ship on that coast, where various things can be found, food, supplies, fresh water, and so forth. We don't have much information about William Hack. He flourished from 1671 to 1702. There's no surviving portrait of him. He made elaborate manuscript charts like the one we just saw, and he was by far the most productive member of the Thames School of Cartography. And although all his maps were manuscript, he did have some interaction with the world of print when he edited a book titled A Collection of Original Voyages in 1699. So those few words about William Hack, and now I'm going to delve into some preliminary material. So we're talking about shipwrecks and treasure and the possibility of recovering treasure from shipwrecks. And I think when we think about recovering treasure from shipwrecks, we think of that as an activity of the 19th, 20th, and 21st centuries. But I want to point out that even in the 16th and 17th centuries, there were equipment and methods for salvaging treasure and artillery from shipwrecks. So I'll begin with this image from Girolamo Cardano's De Subtilitate from 1550. And we have here a diagram of a method for raising a sunken ship using the buoyant force of 5 other ships. And the text says, when ships sink in a channel and there is a plan to pull them up, skiffs laden with rocks are tied to the vessel with ropes by divers in such a way that the ropes are as taut as possible. Then rocks extracted from these skiffs are unloaded into a similar number of empty skiffs, with the result that the skiffs that are emptied out pull vessel up gradually from the depths along with themselves. So using the buoyant force of those emptied skiffs to raise the sunken ship. This is an image from Niccolò Tartaglia's general rule to raise any ship and boats with explanation. And we can see that the general, although the configuration is a bit different, the general idea is the same, using the buoyant force, the buoyancy of two ships to raise a sunken ship. And we can see here the ropes that have been lowered from the two undamaged ships beneath the sunken ship in order to raise it. The same book contains an illustration of a diving bell. I think we would agree that this is not a very practical illustration in the middle of the 16th century, but we will see shortly a diving bell from the 17th century, a diagram of a diving bell from the 17th century that was in fact practical and put in use. Oops, I'm sorry. We have an illustration from Battista della Valle's a book on military technologies, which was first printed in 1521. This image is from the edition of 1558, and obviously it shows a method for breathing underwater, which would assist in the recovery of material from shipwrecks. Diego Ufano's Book of Artillery from 1621, so moving into the 17th century now. And we see that the basic idea here is very similar to what we've seen in the earlier illustrations, that one uses the buoyancy of undamaged ships and a system of ropes to raise a ship from the bottom. And this is in the section, How to Raise a Sunken Ship with its Artillery and Everything in the Water. So it's a book about artillery, and artillery cannons were so valuable that raising them from sunken ships was an important part of knowledge of artillery. And we have here this wonderful illustration of recovering a cannon from a sunken ship. So we can see a very primitive breathing apparatus for the diver. The diver has tied ropes around the cannon and put hooks through those ropes, and then the cannon is raised by a mechanism that gives mechanical advantage to assist in raising the heavy weight of the cannon. The next few illustrations are from a fantastic manuscript from Pedro de Ledesma from 1623, which is in the Naval Museum in Madrid. And the title is Pesca de Perlas y Busca de Galeones, so fishing for pearls and searching for galleons. And some of the text that accompanies this illustration reads, another way and safe invention for 1 or 2 or more people to go down to the bottom of the sea, where there are 16 to 25 fathoms of water, and be there 3 and 4 hours. This illustration is explained as the way to search in any part of the sea from 100 fathoms deep or more to 2 or 3 fathoms, that is to say, from very deep to very shallow, for any ship that is lost in a wide area. And in the text at the left, the author says, I made this invention in 1623 in the 2 islets of Matacumbe to find the depths of the 2 galleons with the silver, the Margarita and the galleon of Don Pedro Pasquier. I found the first in 3 arms of water. And the method here is to drag a chain along the bottom and see what it catches on, and hopefully catch the ship. This illustration is labeled Way of Grabbing the Galleon with Chains Once Found at the Bottom of the Sea. And this illustration is explained as another way to search for any lost ship or galleon in an area where there are rocks and uneven bottom, deep and shallow, and reefs that can interfere with the chain. So instead of dragging a chain on the bottom, the two ships drag a beam from which are suspended multiple anchors. So the idea is that rather than having the chain get stuck on something, the anchors will drag along the bottom and catch on the ship. This illustration is explained as another way of artifice and instrument to know the bottom of the sea after being moored and seizing whatever ship or galleon is there. And we have two divers fixing anchors to the sunken ship, and then a machine for raising the ship, which if we zoom in on, we can see that two men are using the mechanical advantage of these large wheels to raise the ship. And then another illustration, when a ship or galleon has been found at the bottom of the sea, a way to be able to raise it with strong instruments and with ease. So here we have divers fixing anchors to the wreck and a different machine for raising the ship. Here it's a screw and worm gear are used to raise the ship. And we can see the two men turning the screw, which turns the worm gear. And finally, this is the illustration I alluded to before of a sort of diving bell from George Sinclair's The Hydrostatics, published in Edinburgh in 1672. And Sinclair had experimented with a lead diving bell in Tobermory Bay on the Isle of Mull in 1664 to recover cannons from a shipwreck from the Spanish Armada. So this diving bell is an illustration of a diving bell that was actually put in use. So my point with this series of illustrations is that in the 16th and 17th century, there were practical techniques for recovering treasure and cannons from shipwrecks. So knowledge of the location of a shipwreck, and particularly knowledge of what had been on the ship, could be a valuable piece of information for setting about to recover that material from the shipwreck. So returning now to Hack's atlases, he copied them from a derrotero, or book of sailing directions, that had been captured from the Spanish. So I'm now going to talk a little bit about that episode and thus the source of Hack's atlases. And the specific derrotero in question was taken during the capture of the Spanish ship Rosario by the English privateer Bartholomew Sharp in July of 1681. So here's a map showing Sharp's course around South America. The map was made by Basil Ringrose in 1685. So first, Sharp went marauding up the western coast of South America and then sailed back to the Caribbean. And it was in this area where Sharp took the Rosario. And now I'm going to read you Sharp's account of that capture. He says, "This day about 6 o'clock in the morning, we spied a sail, and I gave chase, and about 8 o'clock at night, I took her. She came from Guayaquil and was bound to Panama. Her cargo, for the most part, was silver and cocoa, and in her I found a parcel of manuscripts in Spanish of maps and writings of untold value, for it plainly shows all the ports, bays, roads, harbors, creeks, rivers, plantations, towns, settlements, soundings, shoals, sands, rocks, islands, sea cliffs, dangers, products, trade, where to find wood, water, and all sorts of provisions, where to build or refit a ship, where to find mines, sugar, brandy, oil, etc., and directions how to sail a ship into any of their harbors, and the true distance of the mines of silver and bearings from Arica in Peru. They were going to throw them overboard," that is, the maps, "but my men prevented it, which made the Spanish captain cry out in Spanish, 'Farewell, South Sea.' And truly, by the help of these manuscripts, navigation in the South Seas, the Pacific, is made practicable." So Sharp's list of everything the maps would enable one to find is really impressive. So this is a very detailed and complete guide to the western coast of the Americas. And the phrase from the Spanish captain, "Farewell, South Sea," the implication here is that by the English capturing this atlas, the Spanish would have to bid farewell to the Pacific, because now the English had this spectacular, very useful guide to it. So the Spanish captain saw this as a turning point in the fortunes of the two countries in the Pacific. So what did a Spanish derrotero from that period look like? Well, here's an opening from a derrotero made in 1677, so just 4 years before the episode we just learned about, in the Naval Museum in Madrid. And we can see it's at a large scale and shows the coast in great detail. And we can see the extensive notes about the advantages and disadvantages of different parts of the coast that explain where to anchor, how to anchor, the commodities that can be secured in each port, and so forth. Just another opening in the same manuscript where again we see the very detailed textual notes. So that was Hack's source, or a derrotero like that. So let's move on now to the atlases of William Hack. And I'm just going to show a series of images from Hack's atlases so we can get a feel for them. Here's the authorship page on Hack's Atlas of 1683 in the Free Library of Philadelphia. We can see that as fine an artist Hack was in depicting coastlines and making maps, his artistic skills in rendering human figures were not of the highest order, I think it's fair to say. Here's the dedication page on the same Atlas of Hack in Philadelphia. Here's the index map of Hack's Atlas of 1685 in Greenwich. And just to orient ourselves, here's Acapulco, Panama, Guayaquil, Lima, Peru, Valdivia in Chile, and the Strait of Magellan. So it's a guide to the Pacific coast of the New World from Mexico to the south. And just to have a look at a few maps, we see the same level of detail that we did in the Spanish derrotero, and the maps really are spectacularly beautiful. Again, just a quick look at a few of the maps. And I want to point out that there was some evolution in Hack's atlases. So he made several manuscript copies of the Spanish derrotero that Sharp captured. And here we see his map of the Strait of Magellan in the Hack Atlas in the Huntington Library in Southern California. And this is really a very crude map of the Strait of Magellan, just to orient ourselves. North is to the left. I've indicated the location of the strait, and it's not a detailed or even very accurate map of the strait, so it would not be very helpful in actually navigating the strait. But in a later copy of his atlas, he had found a different source, a better map of the Strait of Magellan. And we see that map here in the manuscript in the John Carter Brown Library in Providence. And as we can see, it's much more detailed image of the strait. So again, there was evolution in Hack's atlases to some extent. And just again, another image to give an idea of the look of Hack's atlases, this map of Juan Fernandez in one of his atlases in the British Library. So the Spanish derroteros do include information about shipwrecks, and I'm now going to show some of that information. And because the Spanish derroteros show information about shipwrecks, we would expect Hack's atlases to do the same, and we will see that they do. So this is a derrotero in London at the Society of Antiquaries, manuscript 221, made in 1669. And this is the map of the Bay of San Miguel in Panama. And here there's Spanish text that says, in these shallows, the Almiranta del Rey was lost in the year 1631. So a brief indication of a shipwreck. This is a different derrotero. It's from about 1675 in the Naval Museum in Madrid. And this is the map of the Estero Cojimies in Ecuador. And we have text here that says, in these shallows of the Cajama River, Domingo Antonio, pilot of the ship of Felipe Alonso Beltran, was lost going to turn close to land in 1612. Let this serve as a warning. And this is important. The shipwreck is indicated as a warning that navigating here is dangerous. So let the fact that there was a shipwreck here serve as an object lesson. Another opening in the same manuscript, the bay by the Rio de Sanya in Peru. And the text here says, in these shallows of the Sanya River, Fernando Gallegos with the ship San Diego of Captain Melchor de Segura, coming from New Spain in 1599, was lost. This will serve as a warning. So again, the shipwreck is used as an indication that this is a dangerous area in which to navigate. A different derrotero, this one in the National Library of Spain from the 17th century. And this is a map of the same bay by the Rio de Sanya in Peru. And here we have a brief indication that in these shallows, Fernando Gallegos was lost with the ship San Diego in 1599. So in this case, without the warning, but basically the same information about a shipwreck on the corresponding map of a different Spanish derrotero. So moving on now to shipwrecks in the atlases of William Hack. As we saw, the Spanish derroteros, of which Hack had one that he was making copies from, include information about shipwrecks. So we would expect information about shipwrecks to appear in Hack's atlases. And we'll begin by looking at Hack's map of Garachine, Panama, in a few different manuscripts. So here's his map of Garachine in his atlas in Philadelphia from 1683. And he says, on this shoal, the Almirante of the King of Spain was lost in the year 1631. So the same information that we've seen in the Spanish derroteros. Hack's atlas in Greenwich. On this shoal was lost the Almirante of the King of Spain in the year 1631. So same information. This is a later atlas by Hack in the John Carter Brown Library from 1698. And here we see the text says, on this shoal was lost the Almirante of the King of Spain in the year 1631. In her was a vast treasure. So this is really interesting. This is new information. I have not found indications of the treasure on shipwrecks in any Spanish derroteros. And as we saw, Hack does not indicate the presence of treasure in 3 of his other atlases, but in this one he does. Looking at his atlas in the Clements Library, on this shoal was lost the Almirante of the King of Spain in the year 1631, in which was an abundance of treasure. So another indication of the treasure on a shipwreck in one of Hack's atlases. This is the Hack Atlas in Berkeley, California, in the Bancroft Library, manuscript 224. Again, the map of Garachine. And he writes, on this bank was the Almirante of the King of Spain lost in the year 1631. This ship was lost in her voyage from Panama to Lima, and in her was great treasure. I mean, from Lima to Panama. So he corrects himself about the direction the ship was going, but for our purposes, the important thing is the indication that there was great treasure in the ship. Moving on to a different map in Hack's atlases, the one of Colanche, Ecuador. This is the map in the atlas in Philadelphia. And here there is no indication of a shipwreck by the Isle of Colanche. But in Hack's Atlas of 1698 in the Clements Library at the University of Michigan, by that same island, he writes, "Rock of Colanche, on which was cast away in the year 1644 a vast rich ship designed for England to relieve King Charles I." So that's a very interesting historical note that I'll sort of set aside and focus for the moment on the fact that it was a rich ship, so indicating to the treasure that was on this ship. The Hack Atlas in the John Carter Brown Library, the map of the same region. We'll zoom in here. The text says, "Rock of Colanche, on which was cast away in the year 1644 a very rich ship, having many millions of money on board and several copper guns." So more detail about what was on the ship. And this is the atlas in the Huntington Library, manuscript 265. And the text here says, "Rock of Colanche, on which was cast away in the year 1644 a very rich ship, having many millions of money on board and several copper guns." So again, emphasis on what was on the ship in terms of treasure and in terms of guns. So we're beginning to see that this is the sort of information that could set in motion an effort to recover this treasure and these guns from the ship. The mere fact that there's a shipwreck, one might wish to investigate, but not having any knowledge of what was on board, it would be a very risky proposition. But knowing that that a shipwreck was a rich one, it becomes much more attractive as a potential target for recovery. This is the manuscript in the Bancroft Library again. Here's the Rock of Colanche, and we have this text above which says, "North-northeast, 8 leagues distant from the point of St. Helena lies a high rock called Colanche, which to windward runneth shoaling for the space of half a mile, and lies 2 leagues from the main. On this rock was cast away in the year 1644 a very rich ship, having then on board 15 million of pieces of 8 and 70 pieces of brass ordnance, and lies in about 7 fathom of water." So this is very detailed information indeed, and the specification of the depth of the water makes it even more attractive as a target for trying to recover the treasure and cannons on board it. Another of Hack's maps of Manta, Ecuador, the atlas in Greenwich. As it happens, there's no indication of shipwreck or treasure here. The Clements Library Atlas from 1698. A wreck in which was millions of reals of plate when lost. So in this case, we don't have the name of the ship, but we do have an indication of the amount of treasure on board. And so again, this makes it very attractive from the point of view of recovery. Hack's Atlas in the Huntington Library. In this ship was 50 millions of royals and 37 pieces of ordnance, and on the same rocks hath been lost many more ships. So in addition to the specific information about what was on this ship when it was lost, that is to say, a very significant amount of treasure and also a significant number of cannons, he indicates that other ships were lost in the same spot. So it makes this location even more attractive as a spot for the potential recovery of treasure, since there are more than one ship that wrecked there. So we've seen that in some of Hack's atlases, he indicates where there was treasure, and in others, he does not. And the pattern is the earlier atlases do not include references to treasure, while the later ones do. So what could have caused this change? What could have inspired Hack to add information about the treasure that was on these ships that had wrecked? I suggest that Hack was inspired to add this information by a spectacular recovery of treasure from a Spanish wreck in the Caribbean by William Phips in 1687. So here's a portrait of Phips, who lived from 1651 to 1695. He was of humble birth in Maine. He became a ship captain and was famous for recovering treasure from a Spanish wreck in 1687, as we just heard. And he was later appointed governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. This is a portrait of Christopher Monk, second Duke of Albemarle, who lived from 1653 to 1688. He's been called a man of little ability or character. Beginning in 1682, he was the chancellor of the University of Cambridge, and from 1687, the governor of Jamaica. And it was Albemarle who funded Phips' voyage to the Caribbean in 1686 to recover treasure from a Spanish shipwreck. And thanks to Phips' success, Albemarle became the most successful treasure seeker in English history. And the meaning of that phrase is that in terms of the amount of money invested compared to the amount of treasure recovered, that ratio was the best in this case ever in the history of England. So first to indicate the location of the wreck and also to indicate its fame, I show this map of Herman Mull, his map of the West Indies from 1709. So a bit more than 20 years after the recovery of this treasure. Just to orient ourselves, here's Cuba, Hispaniola, and the location of the wreck. And he says that indicates the spot. Here, Sir William Phips took up a vast quantity of silver from a Spanish wreck in 1685. So the year is not quite right, but this indicates the continuing fame of Phips' recovery. And when Phips returned to London with this treasure, it caused a sensation. Here is a new sheet announcing Phips' recovery of the treasure. It was published in 1687. It was written by Phips, and it's titled An Exact and Perfect Relation of the Arrival of the Ship, the James and Mary, Captain Phips, commander, with 200,000 pounds in gold and silver, taken up in 9-fathom water from the bottom of the sea, being a supposed wreck of a Spanish galleon, cast away about 43 years ago among the Bahama Islands. And a bit of that text reads, but Albemarle left order that none go ashore till she is unladen of her cargo, being actually 26 tons and 700 pounds weight of silver, 15 tons thereof being pieces of 8, 2 bars or ingots of gold, 17 pounds weight, 6 brass cannon of 300 weight each, being as serviceable as at first, which amount in the whole to above 200,000 pounds. So a really spectacular recovery of treasure by Phips. And as I said, it caused a sensation. There were medals minted to commemorate this recovery. So we see one here with the portrait of Albemarle, and on the reverse, the motto, from the sea comes everything. Another medal struck in commemoration of Phips' recovery of treasure. So on it shows James II and Mary, and on the reverse, we see the Latin motto, always let your hook hang down, and specifies, the text specifies that what we're talking about is a shipwreck discovered. And there's a little illustration here of a very idealized illustration of the recovery of the wreck. So this is not accurate at all, but I think it's the only more or less contemporary image we have of the recovery. So it shows men in a small boat with a line over the side, and we can see the ribs of the sunken ship below. So not an accurate image at all, but that's what we have. And we have here in Sloane's book, A Voyage to the Islands from 1707, images of coins found in the shipwreck with coral growing on them. So again, about 20 years after the recovery of the shipwreck, it still had that fame. It was so famous that coins from the shipwreck were being reproduced, images of them reproduced in books. So it seems very likely that news of Phipps's success inspired Hack to add information about treasure to his maps, but how can we be sure? Well, Albemarle was one of Hack's early patrons, and Hack dedicated one of his atlases to Albemarle, so they were in close contact. And again, Albemarle was the sponsor of Phipps's voyage. So it's likely that there was an exchange of information or passing of information from Albemarle to Hack about the shipwreck that Phipps recovered. And Hack dedicated a map of Port Royal, Jamaica to Albemarle in 1683, so further evidence of a connection between them. Moreover, we know that Hack was very well informed about Phipps's recovery of the treasure because he made a map showing the location of the wreck in 1687, the same year that Phipps returned to London. So here is that map, which is titled The Description of the Bahama Banks, originally taken by Mr. Charles Salmon under the command of Captain Phipps. So Hack was in direct contact with one of the men who had been on board Phipps' ship. So Hack knew all about the recovery of this treasure by Phipps. And just to show a few details of the map, from the map, here is the indication of the plate wreck, meaning the Spanish wreck with lots of silver, the Genoese shipwreck here, the copper wreck here. Text here says, "Here is good roading and smooth water when you are forced from the wreck by a strong northwest wind." And here it says, "Here is good anchoring and smoother water than is on the wreck." So again, the point here is that Hack knew all about Phipps' recovery of treasure. So it seems that, thus inspired by Phipps' treasure recovery, Hack repurposed, or rather additionally purposed, his atlases as guides for the recovery of treasure from Spanish wrecks. So his atlases were already guides to how to navigate and survive in a ship on the west coast of the New World. He added this new information to it, which was information about the shipwrecks and the treasure available on them from Spanish wrecks on the west coast of America. So a new layer of information that he thought would add to the value of his atlases. So in addition to, again, being guides of navigation, they were guides to potential sources of treasure recovery. And in at least one contemporary case, one of his atlases was accorded a much higher valuation because of this new purpose. And that is, this new function of his atlases as guides to treasure and the resultant increase in value of Hack's atlases was quickly recognized. So this is Nicholas Whitson, who lived from 1641 to 1717. He was a statesman and mayor of Amsterdam, an administrator of the Dutch East India Company, and a cartographer and expert on Russia. And here is his famous map from 1687 titled New Land Map of the Northeastern Part of Asia and Europe, extending from Nova Zembla to China. And just to orient ourselves a little bit, here's the Caspian Sea and the Great Wall of China. The point is that Whitson himself was a cartographer, so it's natural to think that he would have an extensive library of maps and geographical books. And in fact, he owned one of Hack's atlases, namely the one in the Bancroft Library, and he tipped this letter into that atlas. And I should emphasize that the Bancroft Library Atlas does include indications of treasure on the shipwrecks. And the letter says, I had collected between 200 or 300 maps, of which, as far as I know, nobody had duplicates. All were drawn very preciously, and one could clearly see many places in the South Sea where ships were sunk, loaded with silver and gold, which would be easy to recover, and up till now have been neglected by the Spaniards. Those maps had cost me around 3,000 guilders estimated. This paper treasure, which was estimated at 20 or 30,000 guilders, I had offered to the court of Madrid and sold for 10,000 guilders and a present worthy of a king, which is to say the sale price was 10,000 guilders and an extravagant present. That is why they were deposited and sealed as Majesty's ambassador in The Hague until the money and the present, which I hoped would surpass the treasure in value, would be received. But the ambassador sent the work without my knowledge overseas to Spain, and the ship was hijacked, and these maps were thrown into the sea. For me, having only a few copies left, I could get no higher payment than 8,000 guilders. So he wrote this letter in 1692. So Whitson valued the atlas at 20 to 30,000 guilders and had arranged to get approximately that amount for it from the Spanish court. And he sold some maps that he had copied from the atlas for 8,000 guilders. For comparison, in terms of price, the Huntington Library Hack Atlas has tipped into it a letter from William Hill, the South Sea Company, dated December 3rd, 1711, in which he says that in 1693, he had bought the atlas directly from William Hack for £70. Georg Heinrich Paritius, in his Cambio Mercatorio of 1709, says that £9 equals 100 Dutch guilders. So the £70 for which the Hack Atlas sold in 1693 is 778 guilders. Thus, one of Hack's atlases was worth about 25 times as much when it was marketed as a guide to finding shipwrecks as it was when it was sold as a beautiful and detailed guide to sailing the western coasts of the Americas. So it's really quite remarkable that Whitson recognized the value of the atlas so quickly. A few other atlas prices for comparison. In 1661, Duke Christian I of Mecklenburg paid 750 guilders for the Rostock Giant Atlas, which is 1.6 meters high, sort of similar in format to the Klenki Atlas in the British Library. In 1681, the Blau brothers sold copies of their 2-volume Atlas of Savoy to Duke Vittorio Amadeo II for 578 guilders each. And Claude de Mesme, Comte d'Avaux, offered 20,000 guilders for the spectacular Atlas Blau van der Hem in 46 folio volumes. So it's basically a Blau atlas with many editions of both printed and manuscript maps in 46 folio volumes. So the price that Whitson had negotiated for a single volume Hack Atlas with information about shipwrecks and treasure was equal to that of this spectacular 46 folio volume atlas. So a few conclusions. The Huntington Library Hack Atlas has been dated circa 1684. It's not dated, so that was a guess by a cataloger. Should be dated post 1687, the date of Phipps's shipwreck recovery, since it includes information about the treasure on shipwrecks. And the fact that it was sold by Hack himself in 1693 tends to confirm a later date for it, later than 1684. Similarly, the undated atlas in the Bancroft Library, which contains information about the treasure on shipwrecks, should be dated after 1687. The information about the treasure on shipwrecks is a very small percentage of the information in Hack's atlases, but represents a really remarkable repurposing, or rather additional purposing, of the atlases, vastly increasing their potential value. It's amazing that at almost the same time that Hack himself, who should have appreciated the value of his atlases better than anyone, sold one of his atlases that contains information about treasure for the equivalent of 778 guilders, while Nicholas Whitson was negotiating to sell another of his atlases for 20,000 guilders, or about 25 times more. Whitson saw the information about treasure in the Hack Atlas, immediately understood its value, and found a buyer who understood it too, the King of Spain, to whom the treasure in the ships had originally belonged. Whitson understood the value of and market for Hack's revised work, that is, Hack's atlases with the addition of information about the treasure on ships, much better than Hack himself did. And finally, a little bit of bookending of our story. Hack's atlases took their origin from a Spanish derrotero that was almost thrown overboard from the Rosario, as we saw, and Whitson's Hack Atlas was thrown overboard on its way to be sold to the Spanish crown. Thank you very much.
Absolutely terrific speech there. Great talk. Lots to ponder about, but I think my first thoughts are very much what cartographers old and new should be thinking about is get treasure on your maps. You could have a very lucrative future if you start marking it up, and X marks the spot could be the way forward. So any budding cartographers in the audience, you know the way to go. So in terms of questions, we've had a few which came through during the course of your talk, Chet. So I'll set the ball rolling with a nice straightforward one. Were the coins issued to celebrate Phipps's recovery cast from metals obtained in the wreck?
Not to my knowledge. So I showed images of the coins from the wreck in a book. I looked for images of coins, of the physical coins from the wreck, and I was not able to find one. I suspect there are some somewhere. That they weren't all melted down. But to my knowledge, well, let me put it this way. I never saw any indication that the metal from which those coins was struck was from the shipwreck.
Thank you very much. And on a, well, I was going to say quite a similar vein, but this is a reasonably straightforward question. Is there any evidence of people using the maps to recover treasure?
Not to my knowledge. So Hack's Atlas never arrived, never reached the Spanish court. He says that he sold the copies that he had for 8,000 guilders, but he does not say to whom. And it would be very interesting to trace that history. But to my knowledge, Hack's atlases have not been used in that way.
Thank you. Seems great pity, doesn't it? After all that, so well, interesting that it didn't go the way that it could have done, been so lucrative.
That's right.
To something more technical. Do you think that Hack couldn't use couldn't use Wright's secant latitude explanation? Hack is noted for his chart frameworks. Instead of a windrose, he mostly employed square grids. What phrase for those frameworks do you favor? A regular rectangular grid as opposed to Mercator, or a quadratic chart?
Okay. I would choose the former, but I will say that this was not a focus of my work here, which was I was really focused on comparing the different atlases and their indications of shipwrecks and treasure, and then figuring out that it was the early ones. The early ones do not have the indications of treasure, and the later ones do, and then trying to understand that difference. So that was my focus, really.
Thank you very much. So Another person listening says they're intrigued by what the hack maps show. It looks like a plan view of the coast, with then a view of what you would see of the hills inland, somehow amalgamated. So are we looking at a planimetric or a bird's eye view? What do you think Hack's trying to do here?
It's a good question. So the maps are very interesting from that point of view. And they seem to be a combination of a map and a coastal view at once, which I imagine was thought to be an efficient way of conveying information. So rather than having the map and the coastal view separately, combine them into one. But it is a distinct style of representation.
It's very striking, isn't it? It's a stunning thing to look at. Going back to the theme of treasure, though, do you know that the information about treasure on Rex was always genuine? Or could it have been made up?
That's a good question. So I'm naturally curious about the source of the information about the treasure on Rex. And I found the source in one case, or maybe two, but I continue to search for his sources of information. How could he possibly know how many cannon were on a particular ship or how much treasure was on it? And those records, I guess the real question is, those records certainly existed, but how did he get access to them? And as I said, I found the source in one or two cases, but I continue to search for his sources in other cases.
Seems like a fascinating trail to be following. Anyway, so much information out there. You really are generating considerable interest from the audience here, Chet, so we'll keep going.
Sure.
One question, is it possible that Hack included details of treasure just to increase the value of his atlases? And again, where do you think he got the information from?
Yeah, so it seems to be very likely that was why he was including this information. So he'd been making his atlases for some time. And I think when Phipps sailed into London with this great treasure that had been recovered, he remembered these indications of shipwrecks and realized that if he could make these indications of shipwrecks attractive targets for the recovery of treasure, he would add a layer of value to his atlases. So again, in addition to being guides to the western coast of the New World, they would be guides to the recovery of shipwrecks, recovery of treasure from shipwrecks. And so that has to have enabled him to make the argument that his atlases had this additional value. It's interesting that he doesn't seem to have been very proficient at marketing them as such. One could have imagined, one does imagine, or at least I imagine, that in presenting one of his atlases or trying to sell one of his atlases, he would make that point that that the atlas showed the locations of shipwrecks and the treasure that was on them. So that was a great opportunity for wealth. But as we saw, he doesn't seem to have been as successful in making that case as Whitson was.
It's intriguing, isn't it? And how Whitson saw the value and tried to exploit it as best possible. But great story. But more questions coming through. So we're keeping you on your toes here, Chet. We're going back to the maps rather than the treasure now.
Sure.
Hack's coastal profiles, in what way do you think they would influence naval officers who were designing charts for the Admiralty?
Another good question. So the question of the influence of Hack's charts is very engaging. So we know that these manuscripts were circulating at the highest levels of English society. So the king and other nobles had Hack's atlases. The only influence I have seen of his atlases is in some of the maps of Herman Moll. So there are some insets on one of Herman Moll's maps that very clearly were influenced by Hack's atlases, and one of Hack's atlases. And as we saw, the South Sea Company, with which Moll was involved, had purchased one of Hack's atlases in 1693, I believe it was. So that was perhaps the source of that influence, but I haven't found other cases of the influence of Hack's atlases, which is surprising, particularly given that comment by the captain of the Spanish ship when Sharp took the atlas, that we have to say goodbye to the Pacific because now the English have these maps that are these wonderful guides. One would imagine that there would have been tremendous interest in Hack's atlases and additional copying from them.
Very interesting, yes. We have a note going back to the earlier question, the very detailed question that we had earlier about the rectangular grid and the quadratic chart. And the comments are, for Chinese maps applying a square grid, Joseph Needham used the term quantitative square grid, but its foundations are cardinally different from that employed by Hack. So that's more of a point of information, so thank you very much. We also have another quite lengthy bit of information, which if I just read it out, the medal maker, George Bauer, was as close as you could get to the official medal engraver. And so the medals, with intimations of wealth to be gained from Spanish shipwrecks, would have supported the government propaganda from the 1660 to the 1720s, rather, to portray the South Seas as a source of infinite treasure, if only the English could gain access. Now, most Hack atlases seem to have been commissioned by third parties, perhaps possessing special information. The presentation to the wealthy and powerful. So Hack was mostly forced to accept what he was offered for his work. In this, he was no different from most of the Thames School chart makers.
Thank you for that comment.
Okay, and we go on. Do we know if any of these treasures have been brought to light in the modern era? You said no one at the time used the maps, but what about today's treasure seekers?
At least one of the wrecks has been recovered, and I don't have the details in mind, but I can look it up in my notes. So at least one of them, and I'm inclined to suspect that Hack's atlases were not used as part of that recovery campaign. And I need to investigate further which of the wrecks have been recovered, if any of the others, but yes, at least one has.
Okay. And does the inclusion of practical information to recover sunken treasure indicate that the later Hack editions were meant as usable navigation guides rather than mere gifts to nobility? That is, these were actually taken on board ships in the late 17th century.
I don't have the information to answer whether the atlases were taken on board ship. I do notice that the later, at least some of the later atlases, tend to be less artistically elaborate than some of the earlier ones, and so perhaps that is some indication of a more practical focus, but I would say I'm not quite ready to say anything conclusive on that subject yet.
Okay. There's another one here. There is an English version of a derrotero in the Navy archives in Lima, which appears to be based on the Spanish derroteros, possibly by way of the Hack copies. And internal evidence points to around 1704. Have you come across any evidence that English navigators or buccaneers commissioned charts from Hack himself?
I have not come across such evidence. That would be very interesting from a couple points of view at least, but I have not found that evidence.
Okay, thank you. Still they're coming, Chet. Does the Hack Atlas in the Library of Congress, I think it's an atlas of the East Indies, have any references to shipwrecks or treasure?
To my recollection, no. But I will say that I have images of all the maps in that atlas, but I haven't gone through it specifically looking for information about shipwrecks. But my recollection from having gone through it quickly is that it does not.
Thanks. Another thing which is worth asking, right at the start of your talk, when we were looking at all those images as to how to raise a ship, do we have any information about salvage teams and how they went about their work? Do we know how numerous they were, how successful they were?
There are works that go into detail about so what I presented was largely visual, but there are works that go into the textual descriptions of recovery campaigns, salvage campaigns, more detail about the techniques they used, the difficulties they faced, and their successes and failures. And if I'd be happy to send bibliography if anyone wants to send me an email.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we are now running out of questions, which is has been quite a spectacular run. Oh, I was speaking too soon. Here comes another one. Would you agree that initially the marking of a shipwreck in relatively shallow waters, especially offshore, was primarily a warning of submerged danger? An invisible sunken ship could be a hazard to ignorant shipping.
That's right. And it's really surprising to me that in the Spanish derroteros, these shipwrecks were seen mostly as warnings. We saw some examples where there are indications of shipwrecks without specifying that this is something, that there's a danger here. But you're right that the indication of a shipwreck in the Spanish derroteros was a warning probably in two ways. First, that this is a dangerous area to navigate in general, and second, there's probably an underwater hazard, depending on the depth of the shipwreck, of course. And I didn't find any examples in Spanish derroteros where the depth of the shipwreck is indicated.
Thank you, Chet. Right, well, I think unless there are any more questions, and bear with me, there's nothing else coming through at the moment. I'd like to thank you on behalf of the Oxford Seminars in Cartography for something very different. We've never been looked at shipwrecks and the like before. We've certainly never seen anything like the Hack manuscript maps in the Oxford Seminars in Cartography. So that has been a real visual pleasure. It's also been a real pleasure to hear about the subject and the way you've been able to monitorize it and give it an economic value as well. And it's a part of the world that is not a part of the world that the Oxford Seminars in Cartography regularly visits. So we've had a bonus every possible way you can look at it. So on behalf of the audience, I'd like to thank you for a terrific evening as far as your UK audience is concerned. I really want to thank Chet enormously for coming along and giving us this wonderful paper. And thank you for your time, everybody who's attended. It's been a real pleasure.